Hey Renew! I'm so excited to be able to come on here and share from the Word today as we finish out our series, No Longer I. Without further ado, I'm just going to jump right into the text. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 7 through 12. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you. So that was kind of a doozy of a text, but just to give some context, 2 Corinthians is the second letter to the Church of Corinthians in the Bible, but scholars believe that it was one of multiple letters that Paul wrote to the Church of Corinth. So something about the Church of Corinth is that Paul had a really complicated relationship with them because they just kept having a lot of problems. So there was like a lot of rebellions against Paul and the true gospel that happened in the church. There was patterns of sin that kept cropping up, and people that would come in to oppose Paul's message into the church. So 2 Corinthians, though, is thought to be the last of the letters to the Church of Corinth. So at this point, most of the members of the Corinthian church have repented, and they're like at a better level than they were before. However, there is a small minority group that actually question the validity of Paul's ministry because he was suffering so much. In their view, Paul's suffering was evidence that God was against him and not that his faith was true. And that issue is addressed a little bit in this passage. But before we get into that address, let's just jump into understanding the passage. So, treasures in jars of clay. This is a huge phrase in Christian lingo. I feel like, it's something that we put on like cups and like t-shirts and things like that. But beyond being a really well-written line of imagery, what does this mean? Humans are vessels, right? We all hold something. So some of us hold ambition, some of us hold pride, greed, desires, trauma, the list goes on and on. But we were created for the purpose of holding a treasure. What is that treasure? So this treasure was addressed actually earlier in the chapter in verses 4 and 6. So it says, the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. That's in verse 4. And then in verse 6, it says, the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. So it sounds pretty similar, but that's the treasure. But what does it actually mean? It means that we're given the privilege of being chosen by God to experience the illumination or the unveiling, which is read as light in these verses, of the good news, which is that Jesus Christ reigns in glory, and he is the image of God. He is the image of God. That declares Christ's deity. Now, side note, that phrase, image of God, that might sound familiar. After all, man was made in God's image, right? So how does this show the deity of Christ? There's a slight nuance that makes all the difference, right? It's man was made in God's image, and Christ is the image of God. So here, Christ is being declared as God. So that truth, the victory of the gospel and the victory of Jesus Christ, is in jars of clay. That means us being stewards of his gospel. Jar of clay is a term used to describe or depict human weakness. Like if you've ever dropped a clay pot, so for example, like a little plant pot or something, right? You know how fragile it is, and it's also not worth that much. Like you drop it, it shatters, and it's not a big deal because you can easily just go buy a new one. So it's like this little fragile, worthless pot holding a beautiful, life-giving treasure. This is so baffling and humbling and beautiful when you think about it, because this treasures and jars of clay idea is not just a term that Paul coined in this letter. Like, it's not an idea that Paul just came up with. It's actually a theme and a motif that's been playing out throughout the story of the Bible as a way that God glorifies himself. Throughout the Bible, you see this theme of God using what is weak in the world to reveal his glory. So Moses, for example, who had a stutter, but God used him to lead his people out of slavery. Or, for example, David, who was just a humble shepherd boy, youngest in his family, and God used him to become the greatest king of Israel. Or even Esther, who was a slave, a member of a slave nation in a foreign country, in a pagan country, but God made her queen and used her to save the people of Israel. I mean, this is most especially true of Jesus' life, right? He's literally born nearly homeless to poor parents. He grows up humble upbringing, son of a carpenter. He walked around among the common crowd, hung out with fishermen and tax collectors and simple people all the time. He died a shameful death on a Roman cross next to robbers. It's just, he is the definition of humility that's seen in his life, right? And then we know, of course, what degree of glory came after that. God uses what is weak in the world's eyes to, as it says in the passage, show that surpassing power belongs to him and not to us. God's endless victory and glory, despite the failings of humanity, is fully culminated through his victory on the cross of Calvary. So when you think of it like that, you can sort of see what a privilege and an honor it is to be a steward of his gospel, or a vessel that holds his treasure. God is using us to glorify himself, and there is no greater role that we can play on the earth than that. So moving on to verse 8, this is showing what a jar of clay or a steward of the gospel is going to have to go through. I mean, when you think of a jar of clay, it's not like a crystal glass, right? It's like, it's used, it's fragile, but it's not kept away on like a high shelf or something. It's used to be a daily object, right? It's like a tool that we use every day. It's filled to be emptied again. It's always handled roughly and treated with a lack of delicacy. This is what we are called to be afflicted, perplexed, persecuted. But I want to emphasize that for each of those bad things, that treasure that we carry, that glory of the gospel and the knowledge of the gospel and the actual presence of the Creator, that resides within us and that can never be taken away. We are resilient, sturdy jars of clay. Like, we are not just jars of clay that are dropped and destroyed. No, we are resilient and sturdy. When we are afflicted, we don't get crushed. When we are confused, we don't get driven to complete mental despair. When we are persecuted, we are not forsaken. When we are struck down, we are not destroyed. That is the promise that we have from the Potter who formed us to hold his treasure. That is the assurance that we have when we go through the toil and the struggle that accompanies life on earth. So when people in Corinth derided Paul for his weakness, Paul reminded them that his weakness was nothing more than an opportunity for God's glory to shine even brighter. So last part, right? It's talking about how we can carry the life of Jesus, carry the death of Jesus in our bodies and also carry his life. What does that actually look like? This is where it connects to our overarching theme of no longer I, right? So I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Our old desires, our old self, our old time as slaves to sin are put to death, just as Christ was put to death, so that we can experience the life that God gives us through freedom and sanctification, just as Jesus rose again in glory. These things are simultaneously happening. We are constantly dying to sin and constantly living for Christ. And this is extended in verse 11. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, which means Paul in this context, but life in you, Corinthian believers in this context. When we go through suffering, peril, grief, pain, persecution, and even death, none of that can stop the spread of the gospel, the growth of the fruit of the Spirit, and the power of the cross. That can be visible to those around us. So Jesus' life and victory and glorious gospel is working within us, residing within us, and simultaneously refining and protecting us as we carry this treasure within our humble jars of clay. So may that be an encouragement to all of you, and may we continue in our daily lives to live with the reality that despite our failings, We are living, breathing opportunities for God's glory to be established more and more.